I opened the door expecting a woman named Marguerite Colfax, and instead I found her standing beside an elderly woman in a wheelchair, both of them silent, both of them waiting to see if I would close the door in their faces. That was the moment my hands went cold, because tucked into the folds of that ordinary Tuesday afternoon was a whisper I would never forget: I didn't know who else could sit with her. Before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you how a blind date turned into something that changed the shape of my whole life, I want to ask you something. If you believe in kindness, if you believe people deserve second chances, if you believe forgiveness can still exist in a world that often forgets how to give it, then please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. We built this community because we believe stories like this one still matter, and I promise you, this story matters. My name is Grantley Ashworth, though most people just call me Grant, and at 34 years old I had convinced myself that romance was a young person's game, something reserved for people who still believed in fairy tales. I owned a small hardware store on the corner of Willow and Pine, a shop my father built with his bare hands before arthritis took his grip and time took the rest of him. I inherited more than wood and nails when he passed. I inherited his quiet stubbornness, his belief that a handshake meant something, and an ache in my chest that never quite closed after my mother left us when I was 19. She didn't die. She just left, the way some people leave, quietly packing a suitcase while the rest of us slept, believing some other life somewhere else mattered more than the one she built with us. I never spoke about it much, not because I didn't feel it, but because feeling it out loud felt like inviting the pain to stay a little longer than it already had. That particular Tuesday started like any other. I opened the shop at 7, restocked shelves, helped Mrs. Fenwick find the right size washer for her leaking faucet, and tried not to think too hard about the blind date my sister Priscilla had arranged for me that evening. Priscilla worked at a community center downtown, and she had taken it upon herself, as she always did, to fix what she called my hermit tendencies. She'd been talking about a woman named Marguerite for weeks, someone she met through a caregiving support group, someone she swore was perfect for me, which is exactly the kind of statement that makes a grown man's stomach twist into knots. She's kind, Grant. She's been through a lot, but she's kind. Just give her a chance, Priscilla had said over the phone the night before, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted me to stop arguing and just listen. I agreed, mostly because saying no to Priscilla required more energy than I had, and partly because some small, stubborn part of me still wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was something out there worth showing up for. We were supposed to meet at a small cafe called the Brightleaf, a cozy little place with mismatched chairs and the smell of cinnamon always drifting from the kitchen. I got there 15 minutes early, the way I always did for anything that made me nervous, as if arriving early somehow gave me control over an uncontrollable situation. I ordered a coffee, sat at a corner table, and watched the door the way a man watches a door when he's terrified and hopeful in equal measure. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, the door opened, and a woman stepped inside pushing a wheelchair. She was maybe 30 years old, with soft brown hair pulled back loosely, wearing a cardigan the color of autumn leaves, and there was an exhaustion in her eyes that no amount of makeup could hide. Beside her, in the wheelchair, sat an elderly woman with silver hair and hands that trembled slightly in her lap, her eyes distant, unfocused, staring somewhere past the room, past the moment, past all of us. The younger woman scanned the cafe until her eyes landed on me, and something in her expression shifted, a mixture of relief and dread, as if she had rehearsed 1,000 different ways to explain herself and none of them felt adequate. She wheeled the older woman toward my table, and before I could even stand up properly, she leaned down slightly and whispered words that would echo in my chest for the rest of that day and many days after. "I'm so sorry. I know this isn't what you expected. I didn't know who else could sit with her. I didn't understand at first." I looked at the woman, then at the older woman in the wheelchair, then back at the woman standing in front of me, clearly Marguerite, clearly nervous, clearly bracing herself for me to make an excuse and leave. "Sit with her?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Marguerite took a shaky breath. "This is my mother, Eleanor. She has dementia." Advanced stages. My sister was supposed to watch her this afternoon, but she called an hour ago saying she couldn't, some emergency at work, and there was no one else. My mother can't be left alone anymore, not even for 20 minutes, and I didn't want to cancel on you again because Priscilla said you were already stood up twice by other people and I didn't want to be the third, but I also couldn't leave her, so I brought her, and I know this is probably the strangest first date you've ever had, and if you want to leave, I understand completely. She said all of this in one long breath, the way people talk when they're afraid that if they slow down, they'll start crying instead. I looked at Eleanor. Her eyes met mine for just a moment, clear and confused all at once, the way a lighthouse flickers before the fog rolls back in. Something in me, some old ache that understood loss and confusion and the particular helplessness of loving someone whose mind was slipping away, made the decision before my brain even finished processing the situation. Sit down, I said. Both of you. Marguerite blinked, clearly not expecting that response. Are you sure? I completely understand if. I'm sure, I said, and I meant it more than I expected to. She sat down slowly, positioning her mother's wheelchair beside the table, and for a moment none of us said anything. Eleanor hummed softly to herself, an old tune I couldn't quite place, her fingers tracing patterns on the tablecloth as if she were remembering a piano she used to play. Marguerite watched her mother with an expression that broke something open in my chest, love layered over exhaustion layered over grief for a person who was still alive but already slipping away in pieces. She used to be a music teacher, Marguerite said quietly, almost to herself. 40 years teaching piano to kids in this town. Half the people in this cafe probably learned scales from her at some point. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that cost something to give. Now she doesn't remember my name most days. I didn't know what to say to that, so I did the only thing that felt honest. I reached over and gently touched Eleanor's hand, the one tracing invisible piano keys on the table, and I said, "That's a beautiful song you're playing." Eleanor looked up at me, and for just a second, just one fragile second, something like recognition passed through her eyes, though I knew it probably wasn't recognition of me specifically, just recognition of kindness, of being seen. She smiled, a real smile, and said, "Claire de Lune. Debussy. My students always struggled with the middle section." Marguerite's eyes filled with tears so quickly it startled both of us. "She hasn't said a full sentence like that in weeks," she whispered. We sat there for almost 2 hours that afternoon, though it didn't feel anything like a traditional first date. Instead of asking Marguerite about her job or her hobbies or her 5-year plan, I found myself asking Eleanor about music, about the piano, about her students. Some of her answers were coherent, beautiful even, full of details about recitals and stubborn 8-year-olds who hated practicing scales. Other answers drifted into confusion, sentences that started in one decade and ended in another, but Marguerite gently guided her back each time with a patience that made my chest ache with something I didn't have a name for yet. I learned, over cups of coffee that went cold and refilled and went cold again, that Marguerite had given up her apartment 2 years earlier to move back in with her mother when the diagnosis came. I learned that her father had passed away when she was 22, that her sister lived nearby but worked long hours as a nurse and could rarely help, and that Marguerite herself worked part-time as a freelance graphic designer, squeezing in projects during the narrow windows when her mother napped or when a home health aide could come for a few hours. "I haven't been on a date in 3 years, she admitted at one point, staring down at her cup rather than at me. Not because I didn't want to, but because who wants to date someone who has to bring her mother along in case things go wrong? I know how this looks. It looks like someone who loves her mother enough to sacrifice her own life for her," I said quietly. "That's not something to be ashamed of." She looked up at me then, really looked, and I saw something shift in her expression, something like disbelief mixed with a fragile, dangerous hope. That first meeting didn't end with a kiss or even a promise to see each other again, not explicitly. It ended with me helping Marguerite wheel Eleanor out to her car, carefully, patiently, learning how to lock the wheelchair brakes and fold the chair into the trunk because Marguerite's hands were shaking too much to do it smoothly herself. Before she drove away, she rolled down her window and said, "Thank you for not running." "I'm not the running type," I told her, though even as I said it, I wondered if that was entirely true, wondered if I had simply never been tested the way I was being tested now. Over the following weeks, I found myself rearranging my life around a woman I barely knew and a mother she barely recognized some days. I started closing the hardware store an hour early on Wednesdays so I could sit with Eleanor while Marguerite ran errands she'd been postponing for months, simple things like getting her hair cut or seeing her own doctor for a checkup she'd been avoiding. At first, Eleanor didn't remember me between visits, and each time I arrived, I had to reintroduce myself, watch her eyes squint slightly as she tried to place my face in a memory that no longer held together properly. "I'm Grant," I would say gently. "I'm a friend of Marguerite's. I like to talk about music with you." Sometimes that was enough to unlock something, and Eleanor would launch into stories about her years teaching piano, about a particular student named Rosalind who eventually became a concert pianist in Vienna, about the years she spent playing in a small orchestra before her hands grew too stiff for anything but teaching. Other days, my introduction meant nothing, and she would stare at me with suspicion, sometimes even fear, and I learned not to take it personally, learned that her fear wasn't about me but about a world that had become an unfamiliar, frightening place. Priscilla was thrilled, in her own dramatic way, when I told her how things were progressing. "I knew it," she said, practically vibrating with excitement over the phone. "I knew you two would understand each other. You've both spent your whole lives taking care of people who couldn't take care of themselves." She wasn't wrong, though it stung a little to hear it phrased so plainly. My father, after my mother left, had slowly folded into himself, drinking more than he should have some years, working himself into the ground other years, and it had fallen to teenage me to keep the house running, to keep him fed, to keep the shop's books balanced when he was too tired or too broken to do it himself. I never resented it exactly, but it had shaped me into someone who understood duty better than joy, someone who measured love in obligations fulfilled rather than moments of lightness. Marguerite understood that language fluently. We fell into something that felt less like romance and more like partnership, though somewhere in the practical rhythm of caregiving schedules and medication reminders and gentle redirections when Eleanor grew confused or agitated, something tender was growing between us, something neither of us dared name too quickly for fear of scaring it away. The real turning point came about 2 months into whatever we were building, on an afternoon that started ordinary and ended in a way that tested everything I thought I understood about patience and love. Marguerite had asked me to stay with Eleanor while she took a rare few hours to visit a friend, something she hadn't done in over a year. I arrived at their small house on Thistledown Lane, a cottage-style home with faded blue shutters and an overgrown garden that Eleanor used to tend before her hands and mind both grew unreliable. Eleanor seemed fine at first, sitting in her favorite armchair by the window, humming softly, her fingers occasionally tapping out silent melodies on the armrest. I made her tea, the way Marguerite had shown me, chamomile with just a touch of honey, and we sat together while I told her about a customer who'd come into the shop that morning trying to return a hammer he'd clearly used to break something. But around 3 in the afternoon, something shifted. Eleanor grew agitated, standing up suddenly, looking around the room with wide, frightened eyes. "Where's Thomas?" she asked, her voice sharp with panic. "Where is my husband? He should be home by now. Something's happened to him." I froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. Marguerite had warned me this could happen, these moments when Eleanor's mind slipped decades into the past, when she believed her long-deceased husband was simply late coming home from work, when the grief of his actual passing years earlier hadn't yet caught up to wherever her mind currently existed. "He's running a little late," I said carefully, remembering Marguerite's instructions never to correct Eleanor harshly during these episodes, never to insist on painful truths that would only need to be relearned and regrieved each time. "Why don't we wait for him together? Maybe some music while we wait?" This seemed to calm her slightly, though her hands still trembled as she sat back down. I found an old radio in the corner of the living room, tuned it to a classical station, and the moment piano music filled the room, something in Eleanor's shoulders relaxed, just slightly, just enough. But then, without warning, she stood again, more agitated than before, and made her way toward the front door with surprising speed for someone whose balance was normally so unsteady. "I need to find him," she said, fumbling with the door handle. "Something's wrong. I can feel it." My heart pounded as I gently but firmly guided her away from the door, worried about the very real danger of her wandering outside alone, confused and vulnerable. She resisted, pushing against my hands with more strength than I expected, tears streaming down her face as she pleaded with me to let her go find her husband. "Eleanor," I said, keeping my voice as steady and gentle as I could manage despite my own racing heart, "let's sit down at the piano instead. I bet you could teach me something. I've always wanted to learn." It was a gamble, an attempt to redirect her towards something familiar and safe, and for a long, terrifying moment, I thought it wouldn't work. But then something shifted in her eyes, that flicker of recognition I'd seen once before at the cafe, and she allowed me to guide her toward the old upright piano in the corner of the living room, an instrument I hadn't even noticed until that moment, covered partially with a lace cloth and framed photographs. She sat down at the bench, and for a moment her hands hovered over the keys, trembling, uncertain. Then, slowly, she began to play, and I swear the entire house seemed to hold its breath. Her fingers, which moments before couldn't manage a doorknob, moved across those keys with a grace and precision that spoke of 40 years of muscle memory, of a lifetime lived in music even as everything else slipped away. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, something I didn't recognize, and tears began sliding down her cheeks as she played, though her expression had softened into something peaceful, something almost transcendent. I sat beside her on the bench, not saying anything, just letting her play, letting the music fill the space where words and memories had failed. When she finished, she looked at me with clarity I hadn't seen from her before, and she said, "Thomas loved that song. I played it at our wedding." Her voice cracked. "He's not coming home, is he?" My chest tightened painfully. "No," I said gently, deciding in that moment that honesty, delivered with as much tenderness as I could manage, was kinder than false comfort. "He's not. I'm so sorry." She nodded slowly, fresh tears falling, but there was an acceptance in her expression that hadn't been there during her earlier panic. "I forget sometimes," she whispered. "And then I remember, and it hurts just as much as the first time. Every single time." I didn't know what to say to that, so I simply took her trembling hand in mine and sat with her in that grief, letting her feel it fully rather than rushing to fix or distract from it. We sat like that for a long while, until her breathing calmed and her eyes grew heavy with the particular exhaustion that follows intense emotion. When Marguerite returned home a couple hours later, she found her mother asleep in the armchair, peaceful, and me sitting nearby, emotionally wrung out but strangely steady. I told her everything that happened, watching her face cycle through fear, then gratitude, then something that looked remarkably like falling in love, though neither of us had said those words yet. "Most people would have panicked," she said quietly, sitting down beside me. "Or called me immediately, or worse, argued with her, tried to force her to remember the truth all at once. I just did what felt right," I said, though the truth was more complicated than that. I had thought of my own father in that moment, of the nights he'd wake up disoriented after drinking too much, calling out for my mother as if she might still walk through the door, and how I'd learned, painfully, through trial and error, that gentleness worked better than correction, that people in pain needed to be met where they were rather than yanked forcibly into harsh reality. That evening marked a shift in our relationship, though it took weeks more before either of us said the word love out loud. We settled into a rhythm that felt less like dating and more like building something permanent, something neither of us had fully expected to find. I learned Eleanor's favorite songs, her favorite stories, the particular way she liked her tea. Marguerite learned about my father, about the mother who left, about the hardware store that represented both a burden and a legacy I couldn't quite figure out how to feel about. But life, as it often does, had more challenges waiting for us just around the corner. About 4 months into our relationship, Eleanor's health took a sharp decline. A fall in the bathroom led to a hip fracture, which led to a hospital stay, which led to a series of difficult conversations about whether she could safely continue living at home even with additional support. The dementia, already advancing, seemed to accelerate during her hospital stay, the unfamiliar environment stripping away what little orientation she had left. Marguerite fell apart during those weeks in ways I hadn't seen before. The woman who had shown such steady patience and strength began to crack under the accumulated weight of years of caregiving, financial stress, and now the terrifying reality that her mother might need a level of care neither of them could provide at home. I promised her, Marguerite sobbed one evening, sitting in the hospital cafeteria after a particularly difficult day of watching her mother struggle with confusion and pain. I promised her I'd never put her in one of those places. I promised her she'd die at home, surrounded by her things, her music, not in some sterile facility surrounded by strangers. I held her while she cried, feeling the particular helplessness of loving someone whose pain you cannot fix, only witness. Sometimes, I said carefully, the promises we make have to bend to reality, not because we love less, but because loving well sometimes means accepting what we cannot control. She pulled back, anger flashing briefly in her tear-streaked face. That's easy for you to say. She's not your mother. The words stung, though I understood the grief behind them. You're right, I said quietly. She's not my mother. But she's become someone I care about deeply, and so are you, and I'm not trying to make this decision for you. I'm just trying to help you carry it. We didn't speak for the rest of that evening, the tension between us heavier than it had ever been. I drove home that night wondering if I had overstepped, wondering if this relationship, built on such an unconventional foundation, was about to crumble under the weight of a crisis it wasn't equipped to survive. For 3 days after that, Marguerite didn't call. I respected the silence, though every hour that passed felt like an eternity, my mind cycling through worst-case scenarios, wondering if I'd lost something precious before I'd even fully realized how much it meant to me. I threw myself into work at the hardware store, reorganizing shelves that didn't need reorganizing, staying late doing inventory that could have waited, anything to keep my hands busy while my mind worried. On the 4th day, Priscilla showed up at the shop, her expression uncharacteristically serious. She called me, Priscilla said without preamble. She's struggling, Grant. Really struggling. The doctors are saying Eleanor needs full-time nursing care, more than Marguerite can provide at home, even with help. She feels like she's failing her mother. What can I do? I asked, desperation clear in my voice. Priscilla studied me for a long moment. Show up, she said simply. Not with answers, not with solutions. Just show up. So I did. I drove to the hospital that evening, uncertain if I would even be welcome, and found Marguerite sitting alone in the small chapel down the hall from her mother's room, her face buried in her hands. I sat down beside her quietly, not saying anything, just present. I don't know what to do, she finally whispered, not looking up. Every option feels like a betrayal. If I keep her home, I'm risking her safety, risking that she falls again, risking that something worse happens. If I move her to a facility, I'm breaking a promise I made when she was still herself enough to ask it of me. What would she want, I asked gently, if she could see clearly, just for a moment, everything that's happening? Marguerite was quiet for a long time. She'd want me to stop sacrificing my whole life for her, she finally admitted, her voice breaking. She always hated that I gave up my apartment, my career, my dating life. She used to say it, back when she still could, that she didn't raise me to disappear into caretaking. But I couldn't just leave her to fend for herself. Maybe, I said carefully, there's a way to honor both things. Find a place close by, a good facility, one where you can visit every day, where she can still hear music, still see your face, but where trained people can help her safely in ways that exhaust you less. That's not abandoning her. That's loving her enough to get her the care she actually needs, while saving enough of yourself to keep showing up for the years ahead. Marguerite looked at me then, something shifting behind her eyes, exhaustion and grief slowly giving way to a fragile kind of relief, the relief of being given permission to make a choice she desperately needed but couldn't grant herself. Over the following weeks, we found a small memory care facility about 15 minutes from Marguerite's home, a place with a garden, with a piano in the common room, with staff who seemed to genuinely care rather than simply process patients through routine tasks. The transition was difficult, filled with tears and moments of Eleanor's confusion and anger at her new surroundings, moments when she didn't understand why she couldn't go home, why Marguerite left each evening instead of staying. But slowly, gradually, a new rhythm emerged. Marguerite visited every single day, sometimes with me, sometimes alone, and I watched her carry less weight with each passing week, watched color return to her face, watched her laugh again in ways I hadn't witnessed since we'd met. She started taking on more design projects, no longer squeezed into narrow gaps of caregiving time, and I watched her rediscover pieces of herself that had been buried under years of exhausted devotion. Eleanor, surprisingly, began to thrive in ways none of us expected. The facility had a music therapy program, and staff quickly discovered her history as a piano teacher. They began asking her to help lead sessions, to sit with other residents and play simple melodies, to teach basic exercises to activity coordinators who wanted to better engage patients with musical backgrounds. Something about having purpose again, even in fragmented, inconsistent moments, seemed to bring her a peace that had been missing during those final chaotic months at home. One particular afternoon, about 6 months after that first blind date at the Brightleaf Café, Marguerite and I visited together, and we found Eleanor sitting at the piano in the common room, surrounded by 4 other residents, patiently guiding a woman named Constance through a simple scale. Eleanor's hands, though slower than they once were, moved with confidence, with purpose, and when she saw us approaching, her face lit up with genuine recognition. "Marguerite," she said clearly, warmly. "And Grant. Come sit, I'm teaching Constance her scales." Marguerite's eyes filled with tears, the good kind, the kind that comes from unexpected joy rather than grief. We sat and listened as Eleanor guided her makeshift class through a simple piece, patient and encouraging in ways that echoed, I imagined, the very same patience she'd shown decades of piano students throughout her career. Afterward, while Constance and the other residents were escorted back to their rooms for afternoon rest, Eleanor turned to us with unusual clarity. "I remember the café," she said softly. "The first time I met you, Grant. You asked about Claire de Lune." My throat tightened with emotion. "You remember that?" She smiled, a fragile, luminous smile. "Some days are clearer than others. Today feels clear." She reached out and took both our hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong. "I want to say something while I can. Thank you for not running away that day. My daughter has spent so long taking care of everyone else. She deserves someone who shows up, even when things are hard, even when they're strange or unexpected." Marguerite squeezed her mother's hand, tears streaming freely now. "Mom. Let me finish," Eleanor said gently, though her voice carried unmistakable warmth. "I know I forget things. I know some days I won't remember this conversation at all. But right now, in this moment, I see how happy you are, and I want you to know that makes me happy too. Don't feel guilty for finding joy, sweetheart. That's not a betrayal of me. That's exactly what I always wanted for you." None of us spoke for a long moment, the weight of that clarity settling over us like something sacred, something we all understood might not come again for weeks, possibly longer, given the unpredictable nature of her condition. But it didn't matter. The moment existed, fully and completely, and we held on to it. Over the following year, our relationship deepened in ways that felt inevitable in retrospect, though we'd stumbled into each of those steps rather than planning them deliberately. I proposed to Marguerite on a bright Saturday afternoon in early spring, not with elaborate plans or grand romantic gestures, but simply by bringing her to the hardware store after hours, showing her the small back office where my father used to sit doing paperwork, where I'd spent countless hours as a teenager doing homework while waiting for him to finish his day. "This place has always been about legacy," I told her, holding a small ring that had belonged to my grandmother, one of the few things my mother left behind when she disappeared from our lives. "About building something that lasts, something that means more than just the sum of its parts." I want to build that kind of legacy with you. Not despite everything we've been through together, but because of it. Because I've never felt more certain of anything than I am of wanting you and Eleanor to be part of my family, for as long as we're given together." She said yes through tears, and later that same afternoon, we drove straight to the memory care facility to tell Eleanor, though we both knew there was a real possibility she wouldn't remember or fully understand the news. But that day happened to be one of her clearer days, and when we told her, she cried happy tears, asking immediately if she could still play Claire de Lune at the wedding, insisting that some traditions mattered too much to skip regardless of circumstances. We were married in early autumn, in a small ceremony held in the garden behind the memory care facility, a decision we made deliberately so Eleanor could attend without the stress and disorientation of an unfamiliar venue. She sat in her wheelchair near the front, dressed in a beautiful lavender dress Marguerite had picked out specifically for the occasion, and though she grew confused partway through the ceremony, asking loudly who the pretty bride was, the facility staff gently redirected her attention, and by the time the ceremony concluded, she was smiling and clapping along with everyone else, caught up in the joy of the moment even if the specific details remained elusive. At the reception, held in the very same common room where Eleanor had taught piano lessons to fellow residents, she surprised everyone by asking to play something for the newly married couple. Her hands trembled as she sat down at the piano, and for a moment I worried the moment might slip away from her entirely, worried the pressure of the occasion might trigger confusion rather than clarity. But then her fingers found the keys, and Claire de Lune filled the room, slower than it once might have been played, imperfect in places where her memory faltered, but unmistakably beautiful, unmistakably full of love poured into every note. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room, and Marguerite knelt beside her mother's wheelchair, resting her head against Eleanor's shoulder, both of them crying quietly while the rest of us watched a moment of pure, undiluted love unfold in front of us. Eleanor passed away peacefully about 18 months after our wedding, in the springtime, on a bright morning when sunlight streamed through her window and, according to the nursing staff, she had been humming softly to herself in the hours before she slipped away. Marguerite was with her when she passed, holding her hand, and though the grief that followed was immense, immeasurable in the way that losing a parent always is, there was also a strange, unexpected peace in how it happened, gentle and quiet, surrounded by love rather than fear. At the funeral, Marguerite asked me to say a few words, and standing in front of a room full of people whose lives Eleanor had touched throughout her decades of teaching, I found myself telling the story of that first blind date, of walking into a cafe expecting one thing and finding an entirely different, more profound experience waiting for me instead. I talked about the whispered words that had haunted and humbled me that day. I didn't know who else could sit with her, and how those words ended up defining not just that single afternoon, but an entire chapter of my life that I never expected but would never trade for anything. Sometimes, I told the gathered mourners, many of them former students of Eleanor's, now grown adults with families of their own, the people who complicate our plans the most end up becoming the ones who complete us in ways we never anticipated. I walked into that cafe expecting to meet a woman named Marguerite. Instead, I met a family. I met a woman whose fingers still remembered melodies even after her mind forgot names. I met a daughter whose love for her mother taught me more about devotion than anything else in my 34 years of life up to that point. And somewhere in the space between confusion and clarity, between grief and joy, I found the family I didn't know I was looking for. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that love often arrives in forms we don't expect, wrapped in circumstances that seem impossible or overwhelming at first glance, I want you to take a moment before this story ends to think about the lesson sitting quietly at its center. Think about the people in your own life who might be carrying burdens too heavy to voice out loud, the people whose whispered apologies, like Marguerite's whisper that first day at the cafe, might actually be invitations rather than warnings. I'd love for you to leave a comment below sharing a moment when someone's unexpected kindness changed the course of your life, or a time when showing up for someone else's hardest moment led you somewhere beautiful you never anticipated. Marguerite and I still run the hardware store together now, 5 years after that first strange, unforgettable blind date. We eventually had a daughter of our own, and we named her Eleanor, after the woman who taught us that even as memory fades, love finds ways to remain, humming quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise up and remind us why we chose to show up for each other in the first place. There's a small upright piano in the corner of our living room now, the very same one Eleanor used to play, and though neither Marguerite nor I have much musical talent ourselves, we've started saving for lessons for our daughter, hoping that someday she'll sit at those same keys and understand, in whatever way a child can understand, the legacy of patience, devotion, and unexpected love that brought her into existence. If this story touched your heart today, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment below, share it with someone in your life who might need a reminder of hope, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. We believe, here in our community, that the most beautiful parts of life often arrive disguised as inconvenience, as complication, as the moments we're most tempted to run from rather than embrace. I hope Grant and Marguerite's story reminds you, the way it continues to remind me, that sometimes the family we're searching for isn't the one we expected to find, but the one that finds us exactly when we need it most, whispered apology and all. Thank you for spending this time with us, for letting this story into your heart, and for being part of our growing family of people who still believe, despite everything, in kindness, in second chances, and in the quiet, persistent power of showing up for one another when it matters most.